Chapter 687, Notes on Sword 2. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. From today onward, you may stay secluded at the Sword Pavilion to cultivate and refine your Sword 2 skills to reach the Yin-Yang Chaos Realm, helpfully before the 9th day of the 9th month, said the Moonbriar Sword Saint. Please feel free to consult the 9 sword holders or myself, if you come across anything you don't understand. Zhang Yuochen immediately stood up and bowed to him, saying, Sword Saint, I will agree to represent the Yin and Yang sect in the Sword Technique Conference on one condition. Please, said Moonbriar Sword Saint. Zhang Yuochen said, I do not wish to practice at the Sword Pavilion. Gai Tanjiao looked puzzled. She stood up, about to inquire further. Many would be stunned to hear Zhang Yuochen reject the Moonbriar Sword Saint's offer for him to become his disciple, but the majority of people could still accept this. However, he had just rejected the Moonbriar Sword Saint yet again, this time on his offer for Zhang Yuochen to practice in the Sword Pavilion. Did he not know that many were dying to have the opportunity to practice in the Sword Pavilion, even just once? Yet they were not given the opportunity. The Moonbriar Sword Saint immediately gestured for Gai Tanjiao to sit down, then turned to Zhang Yuochen with a puzzled look, saying, But why? You have to be aware that there are various sword manuals and bountiful resources in the Sword Pavilion. Moreover, you can consult with the 9 sword holders here. One more thing you may not be aware of is that the time you spend practicing in the first level of the Sword Pavilion is double compared to the outside world. By extension, the second level of the Sword Pavilion will provide you with triple the time compared to the external world. Based on the realm you have reached in the Tower of Sword now, you may practice in the second level of the Sword Pavilion. By practicing in the Sword Pavilion, you might still stand a chance of reaching the Yin-Yang Chaos Realm of Sword 2 by the 9th day of the 9th month. However, if you don't practice here, there's no way you will reach it. Zhang Yuochen had a determined look in his eyes. My heart is not here. This statement made the Moonbriar Sword Saint want to laugh and cry at the same time. Are you thinking that we are trying to lock you up here by letting you practice in the Sword Pavilion? The Moonbriar Sword Saint let out a bellowing laugh. Zhang Yuochen replied, If a sword practitioner's heart is bound, the speed of his practice and cultivation will be impeded regardless of how bountiful the external resources are. Don't you think the state of mind of the sword practitioner is of utmost importance, Sword Saint? Although the Moonbriar Sword Saint thought Zhang Yuochen's reasoning was somewhat stretched, he had no idea how to respond. Zhang Yuochen had rightly pointed out that the state of mind was of utmost importance. All other external resources were complementary. The higher a person's level of cultivation, the better he was able to comprehend this. However, the same words proceeding from the mouth of a youth was somehow much less unconvincing. Could such a young sword practitioner have reached such a realm? Seeing that Zhang Yuochen had already attained such a level of comprehension, the Moonbriar Sword Saint thought it wise not to press him further. After a moment of pondering, he tossed a palm-sized token to Zhang Yuochen. If that is the case, please take this sword token. With this token, you can enter and leave the Ancient Gods Mountain freely. You are welcome to practice in the Sword Pavilion anytime. Zhang Yuochen caught the token in his hand. As he looked at it, he realized that the word sword was protruding on the surface of the token. The token seemed to contain a forceful saint power. It was as if there was a river within it. With the sword token, you may enter and leave the Ancient Gods Mountain as you wish. This rule clearly implied that the sword token was of great significance. Zhang Yuochen kept the sword token, took a bow and said, Thank you Sword Saint for granting my wishes. The Moonbriar Sword Saint smiled and said, You set your condition, I will too. Every month from today onwards, you must come into the Sword Pavilion for cultivation for at least 9 days. This is not too much ask, is it? Not at all, answered Zhang Yuochen. On the first level of the Sword Pavilion, there are a number of scrolls. They are notes left behind by deceased sages who attained Sword 2. You may borrow them to have a look. I believe they will be very helpful to you. Once he had finished instructing them, the Moonbriar Sword Saint sent Zhang Yuochen and Gai Tanjiao on their way. After they exited King Room 18, Gai Tanjiao brought Zhang Yuochen to collect the Sword 2 notes. She turned to look at him several times, as if she had something to say to him. Do you have something to say? Asked Zhang Yuochen. Gai Tanjiao smiled. Don't you regret throwing away the opportunity to become a sword saint disciple? I won't regret it once I actually become a sword saint. Putting his arms behind him, Zhang Yuochen walked past Gai Tanjiao toward the bookshelves ahead of them. Gai Tanjiao stared at Zhang Yuochen in surprise. He might have looked mild and gentle, but inside, he was actually driven and ambitious. There were thick scrolls of handwritten notes left behind by the sword practitioners on what they had learned from their study of the Tao of Sword. Every scroll was deemed as precious as a priceless treasure. As Zhang Yuochen stood at the foot of the shelves, he scanned over the sea of scrolls, each labeled with the words Sword 2. However, the names of the inscriber differed from one another. Saint Mingzu, Half-Saint Yao Long, Moonbarrier Sword Saint. Zhang Yuochen took the scroll inscribed by the Moonbarrier Sword Saint from the shelf and started to read it. According to the Moonbarrier Sword Saint's explanatory notes, Sword 2 was yin and yang. One yin and one yang constituted an entire heaven and earth. The Moonbarrier Sword Saint had divided Sword 2 into 5 realms, namely, yin-yang alternation, yin-yang chaos, separation of yin and yang, blend of yin and yang, yin-yang infinitude. One would be deemed to have reached the great completion of Sword 2 only when he had attained yin and yang infinitude. The notes the Moonbarrier Sword Saint had made were rather obscure, so much so that it took Zhang Yuochen 4 hours in all to finish going through Sword 2. Moreover, he only understood 20% of its content. Apparently, Sword 2 was many times more profound than Sword 1. A common practitioner would not be able to grasp it even with the help of the Sword Saint's notes. Zhang Yuochen closed the scroll and held it by his side. He continued to search for notes by other sword practitioners. Zhu Hongchen, the Sword Emperor. Zhang Yuochen began to read the notes the Sword Emperor had written. The Sword Emperor's understanding of Sword 2 was rather similar to that of the Moonbarrier Sword Saint. However, he viewed Sword 2 as male and female. Yin and yang represented the nature of heaven and earth, which could be abstract and impractical. It was often extremely tedious to practice it. Male and female, however, was the manifestation of yin and yang, as well as being human. The union of a man and a woman produced new life. This way, it ingested life into the sword technique. At the same time, it added a layer of transformation to yin and yang. The Sword Emperor had also divided Sword 2 into 5 realms. It required a shorter time for one to practice Sword 2 using the Sword Emperor's method. However, one had to unite yin and yang with a woman every time he moved to the next realm. This woman was called the swordsman's maidservant. To reach the great completion of Sword 2, one would require at least 5 swordsman's maidservants. Moreover, the great benefits of becoming swordsman's maidservants was that these women would themselves become top superiors among sword practitioners. Zhang Yuochen shook his head and smiled. The Sword Emperor was a rather romantic and unconventional libertine. Even his understanding and practice of the Tao of the Sword was so unorthodox. Zhang Yuochen was quite familiar with the Sword Emperor. His dissoluteness had brought rumors all over Kunlun's field. However, he had never forced the women. It was always consensual and often the women had thrown themselves at him. He was, unfortunately, unable to fully accept the Sword Emperor's method of practice. While the Sword Emperor was able to be totally disengaged with the women he united with, Zhang Yuochen did not think he could be like him. If he were to have a relationship with a woman, he would feel an obligation to her all his life. There were still many things he could learn from the Sword Emperor's notes. So Zhang Yuochen decided to keep the scroll with him. Inscribed by Thousand Bone Empress. Zhang Yuochen's eyes lit up when he spotted this scroll. He took a turtle's shell down from the top of the shelf and saw that there were tiny ancient inscriptions on its surface. Each of the ancient characters exuberated a piercing Sword 1 power that directly penetrated into the hearts of men. No one was sure if these characters had been personally inscribed by the Thousand Bone Empress onto the turtle shell. The Thousand Bone Empress's explanation of Sword 2 was even more obscure. Zhang Yuochen spent 6 hours reading through it, just managing to get a tenth of its content. The Thousand Bone Empress's comprehension of Sword 2 was another system altogether, and it differed from that of the Moonbarrier Sword Saint and the Sword Emperor in many different areas. She interpreted Sword 2 as being similar to day and night. During the day, one should practice and cultivate day sword, by observing the blue skies and white clouds. During the night, one should practice and cultivate night sword, by observing the moon and stars. When one's cultivation reached the state of merging day and night, he would have reached the great completion of Sword 2. By then, one sword movement would bring about the reversal of day and night. The Thousand Bone Empress's understanding of Sword 2 was very mysterious. Zhang Yuochen thought he could gain a lot from it, so he kept her notes, intending to bring them back with him to study. Zhang Yuochen went through several other scrolls and came to the conclusion that the system written by the Moonbarrier Sword Saint was by far the most universal. It was not as extreme as that of the Sword Emperor, nor was it as mysterious and obscure as that of the Thousand Bone Empress. That was why it was the most universally accepted set of notes. Zhang Ruojin picked up the 3 scrolls and exited the Sword Pavilion. He returned to the square at the foot of White Stone Sacred Cliff. It was evening and a clear round moon suspended in the sky. An invisible, subtle force dispersed the clouds to display a dark cobalt sky. Zhang Yuochen glanced in the direction of the altar at the center of the square. A strange light flashed across his eyes. The altar, which was 30 feet tall, was built of stacked-up pieces of chiseled jade stones. Each stone was inscribed with mysterious prints. Under the shine of the moonlight, the prints gave out a gentle glow. Zhang Yuochen walked up to the altar. He put a hand on one of the jade stones and began releasing spiritual power as a test. He had seen a heaven and earth altar once before in the wood spirit primitive world. For this reason, he had some knowledge of the heaven and earth altar. Zhang Yuochen managed to assess each character of inscription on the stone using his spiritual power. This altar is completely different from the heaven and earth altar. Could I have made a wrong guess? No, he muttered. Suddenly, Zhang Yuochen sensed something incredible. There was nothing unusual about the spiritual power on the surface of the altar. However, when his spiritual power flowed towards the bottom of the altar, he immediately lost contact with it. It was as if his spiritual power had sunk to the bottom of the sea and vanished completely. Unless could there be a different universe at the bottom of the jade stone altar? Zhang Yuochen was stunned. He continued to use his spiritual power to investigate and quickly found an entrance at the northeastern corner of the jade stone altar.